Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, we're going to be looking at another one of Dr. William Lane Craig's videos, actually two videos. These are about the resurrection. The first is going to be on the facts, and the second is on the best explanation of those facts. And I'm joined by Dr. Max Baker-Hytch. He is a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Hytch.
Thank you so much for having me, Jordan.
I guess we're just going to go ahead and jump right into this video, unless you have any kind of comments you want to preface the discussion with.
No, I think, no, let's just dive right in and see where we go from there.
All right, sounds good. Here we go.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? As we explore this question, we need to address two further questions. What are the facts that require explanation? And which explanation best accounts for these facts?
Okay, before the facts are listed, so they've just kind of set up, they've got the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? And they're going to first give some facts and then come up with the best explanation of the facts. Did you have anything you wanted to say about that kind of setup for the videos?
Not a lot. I think that's, in general, a fair framework to use. I think, so obviously one of the things that's slightly complicated about this whole thing is that, in a sense, you're trying to do things in two stages. And when you move to the second stage, you're having to kind of treat everything as though the facts that you've laid out in the first stage are just kind of in the bank, can be treated as sort of basically.
We're going to hold those fixed.
We're going to hold those fixed. And of course, some of the facts that I'm assuming they're about to list are going to be more disputed than others. And so, it's not completely clean, but I think in general, it's a fairly kind of, unavoidable way of doing things. I think you do in general, I think, want to separate out the question of historical data from the question of sort of inference to the best explanation, and of course, philosophical questions about the prior probability of miracles come into play at that point as well. So I do think there is some sense in keeping those two discussions somewhat separate.
All right, we'll continue.
There are three main facts that need to be explained: the discovery of Jesus's empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's examine each of these. Fact number one. The discovery that Jesus' tomb was empty is reported in no less than 6 independent sources, and some of these are among the earliest materials to be found in the New Testament. This is important because when an event is recorded by 2 or more unconnected sources, historians' confidence that the event actually happened increases, and the earlier these sources are dated, the higher their confidence. Moreover, the Gospels indicate that it was women who first discovered that Jesus' body was missing. This is likely historical because in that culture, a woman's testimony was considered next to worthless. A later legend or fabrication would have had men make this discovery. Our confidence in the empty tomb is further increased by the response of the Jewish authorities. When they heard the report that the tomb was found empty, they said that Jesus' followers had stolen his body, thereby admitting that Jesus' tomb was, in fact, empty. Most scholars, by far, hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb.
There were kind of 3 lines of support for that first fact.
That's right. And I think a sort of cherry on the top of the cake at the end was this claim that by far the majority of scholars accept this as historical. Now, I might actually just start there on this issue of scholarly consensus. So I want to say up front that I'm not totally kind of on board with this methodology that is employed by some people in this area. I think to a degree, William Lane Craig, but especially Gary Habermas, of putting a great deal of stock in kind of a high degree of scholarly consensus as seemingly being both necessary and sufficient for it being rational to accept a historical fact. So I think what I probably want to say is that maybe a strong scholarly consensus around a particular fact is sufficient for making it rational to accept it. I mean, even there might be some complications, but yeah, if that scholarly consensus spans a wide range of kind of ideological backgrounds and so forth, it doesn't easily look like it could be put down to some kind of groupthink. Then yeah, that does seem to carry some weight, but I definitely don't want to say that it's necessary to have such a strong scholarly consensus for it to be rational to accept a given historical fact. So I think I would just put that kind of slight question about the general methodology that might be implicit here right up front. So in terms of the empty tomb, I think one needs to be careful in claiming, and I do actually think they slightly overstate in that video. I mean, saying that by far the majority accept it. I mean, we've really got Gary Habermas's kind of surveys that he's tried to do of the literature to go on. That's really the main thing we have here to go on. And my understanding is he's slightly revised his claim from saying formally that it was about 3/4 of scholars who've written on the topic of the empty tomb who affirm it, to now saying something like 2/3, which is, it's still a majority, but it's not kind of an overwhelming majority. Interestingly, Michael Licona doesn't use the empty tomb as a fact in his very large book on the resurrection, because he doesn't think he doesn't consider it to be a strong enough scholarly consensus to be considered as historical bedrock, as he puts it. Now, as I said, I don't put as much weight on scholarly consensus. I don't see it as being a necessary condition for rationally accepting a given historical fact. I think, yeah, that the point about multiple independent early sources is significant. So, certainly it looks like Paul and the Gospels, I think we can be highly confident that there's independence there, right? And so 1 Corinthians 15, yes, while it doesn't say the words "and his tomb was found empty," for someone trained as a Pharisee like Paul was, and given Pharisaic beliefs about bodily resurrection as the kind of long-awaited future destiny of the righteous dead. Yes, for someone like Paul to say that he was buried, he uses the Greek word etaphe, he was entombed, and then on the third day he was raised. That does seem to strongly imply an empty tomb. And then, yeah, of course, the gospel accounts. Now, one reason I think that there is some independence between those gospel accounts of the empty tomb is something that Richard Bauckham has pointed to, which is as he puts it, the absence of list fixing. So, the different synoptic evangelists give lists of the different women who were present at the burial of Jesus, who had witnessed the crucifixion, were there at the burial, and then who came on the Sunday morning. And as Bauckham points out, the lists vary between the Gospels. It doesn't look like the evangelists have tried to harmonize their accounts of the lists of the women who were there, even though on the pretty widely held view, that Mark was the earliest gospel, and Luke and Matthew had access to Mark, which I would accept. Luke and Matthew could have tried to synchronize their lists of the women who were there, but it doesn't appear they've done that. And Luke even has the names of some women that aren't even mentioned at all in Matthew and Mark. I believe Joanna is one of the women who Luke mentions that's not mentioned at all in the others. And so there seems to be really no need for them to do that. And it certainly doesn't look like they're striving to kind of create an impression of harmony. And I would suggest, as Borkham says, that the best explanation is that they are taking care to name those women whose testimonies they had close access to, in the case of each evangelist. So yeah, and then I would just say, in terms of the embarrassment factor, the centrality of female eyewitnesses to the gospel empty tomb stories. I do think that has weight, and Dale Allison, in his recent book on the resurrection, which is, Dale Allison's a very influential and respected scholar, and I'm not saying I agree with him on everything, but I think he has a pretty decent discussion of the empty tomb. And he thinks that he concludes that the centrality of female eyewitnesses is probably something that a fictionalizing account would not have. And sometimes it's pointed out by skeptics, or it's claimed by skeptics, that the gospel authors sort of had no choice but to use women eyewitnesses in their fictional account. But I think Allison, dispatches that idea pretty well. So the thought is that, Allison makes the point. So why would it be kind of sinning against established fact more to have male disciples stick around in Jerusalem and come to the tomb than it would be to deny that they fled at all in the first place? It's not really clear why. And in any case, Luke and John do say that secondary to the female eyewitnesses observing the empty tomb, we do also have some visits to the tomb by male disciples. So clearly John and Luke could have just said that it was only Peter and the beloved disciple who went to the tomb. But also, they could have said that it was Joseph of Arimathea. That would have been sort of historically plausible, given the fiction that they were trying to spin on this hypothesis. Joseph of Arimathea looks like he was the owner of the tomb. So I do think that consideration does hold weight.
Okay, well, if you're good to continue, we'll go on.
Great.
The appearances of Jesus alive after his death. In one of the earliest letters in the New Testament, Paul provides a list of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Finally, he appeared also to me. Furthermore, various resurrection appearances of Jesus are independently confirmed by the gospel accounts. On the basis of Paul's testimony alone, virtually all historical scholars agree that various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ.
I think there's a few things to talk about there. So, it's interesting that the main, I think that the main source really that is in view here is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5 or 3 through 8. And I think that in some sense is understandable because it's the earliest source we have, and because it's from Paul, and it seems very likely that it's Paul relaying traditional material that comes from the Jerusalem apostles. Yes, it's understandable that one would put a lot of emphasis on the value of that source. I think I would have to say, though, I am in agreement with people who are critical of the general approach of just putting all of your eggs in that basket with 1 Corinthians 15, because you just don't get any detail at all about what those appearances were like from 1 Corinthians 15 alone. Okay, so maybe you could make some kind of inferences about what Paul thought they must have been like based on his discussion of the resurrection body later on, but that's definitely seems that there's certainly challenges in trying to do that. And at the end of the day, those are at best kind of inferences. We don't have Paul telling us that they ate meals with Jesus, and that he, invited them to touch him, and the rest of it. So yeah, in general, I think a concern with the sort of minimal facts approach that would even count sort of Gerd Ludeman's affirmation of the appearances as being kind of helpful to the case is going to struggle with the fact that, Gerd Ludemann or Bart Ehrman or John Dominic Crossan, any of these scholars on the more liberal end of the scholarly spectrum, what do they think the appearances were? Well, they're going to say that they were fleeting, at best, kind of fleeting, ethereal, non-bodily, perhaps ghost-like appearances, and certainly not the kind of thing that I think that people like Gary Habermas would want to defend the resurrection as having actually been like. And so I do think there is an issue there. And I do think, I do think one would need to go beyond just 1 Corinthians 15 and actually put some work into defending at least the thought that the types of encounters that the gospel resurrection narratives portray are rooted in what the eyewitnesses claimed, because otherwise I don't think one would have much of a basis to argue for a bodily resurrection on the basis of the kind of appearances that Gerd Ludemann would grant as having happened.
Number 3, the disciples' belief in the resurrection. After Jesus' crucifixion, his followers were devastated, demoralized, and hiding in fear for their lives. As Jews, they had no concept of a Messiah who would be executed by his enemies, much less come back to life. The only resurrection Jews believed in was a universal event on Judgment Day after the end of the world, not an individual event within history. Moreover, in Jewish law, Jesus' crucifixion as a criminal meant that he was literally under God's curse. Yet somehow, despite all of this, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. They were so completely convinced that, when threatened with death, not one of them recanted. Even the Pharisee Paul, who persecuted Christians, suddenly became a Christian himself, as did Jesus' skeptical younger brother, James. Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him.
All right, so what do you think about that third fact?
Well, I mean, I think there's no serious doubt about the incredible earliness of the disciples' belief in Jesus having been raised. And yes, given what we know about Jewish afterlife beliefs at the time of Jesus, from sources such as Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, burial practices, and so on. Yes, I think we can be very confident that when a group of first century Jews used the word resurrection, in the New Testament, so that's going to be the word anastasis or the verb anistemi, then yes, when they use those words, it's pretty clear that what they mean by that is an event that happens to a corpse. And that they come to have this belief that this is the fate that Jesus has undergone within a very short space of time of Jesus being crucified. I do think that is something that one can be confident of. So yeah, I think I'd want to urge some caution around the claims about martyrdom. So it seems to me that we can be pretty confident in the martyrdoms of 3 of the apostles, and they happen to be the 3 apostles who are mentioned in that formula in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. So namely Peter, James, and Paul. So we know about Peter's martyrdom, we know about Paul's martyrdom, it seems like they probably both died during the Neronian persecutions in around 64 AD. For example, the letter First Clement, an epistle by a leader in the church in Rome, not that long after, talks about the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. So yeah, I think we can be fairly confident that Peter and Paul did die for their faith in Jesus. James, we can be also pretty confident as well, and we have attestation of that from both Josephus and I think a 2nd century church leader called Hegesippus. Now, beyond that, and I think I have to say I haven't read Sean McDowell's book, The Fate of the Apostles, but I think the general reception of it is that he's been fairly careful there, and I gather that basically the thrust of it is that quite a lot of the traditions that have grown up around other members of the apostles, besides the ones I just talked about, are quite late, and it's not really clear that very much weight can be put on them. So it seems to me really that yeah, as I said, we can have confidence in those three, but I don't think we really know what happened to the others. And I think I would say it's overclaiming really to say that not one of them recanted. I don't think we know that. You could try to appeal to a kind of argument from silence that it would be so kind of scandalous if one of them had recanted that we would have heard of it. But I don't think in general arguments from silence in ancient history are very strong. And, I would say that countering, various skeptical arguments from silence, and I think to be consistent, one would have to say the same about kind of pro-Christian arguments from silence. So yeah, I think on the whole, the martyrdom claim doesn't have as much weight as I would say the video claims it does. What I think is fair enough is the thought that there was a context of persecution, and indeed violent persecution, in that very early stage of the apostles' proclamation of the resurrection in Jerusalem. And I think our best source for that is Paul. So Paul's own autobiographical statements about his past as a Pharisee, and as he puts it, someone who violently persecuted the church. And that's something he says of himself in Galatians. I think we can be pretty confident that the context in which the apostles were first proclaiming Jesus' resurrection was one in which there was danger. And at least they were aware that there was a risk to their lives, whether or not we can actually know how many of them ended up being martyred. Paul does, when he talks about his own past as a persecutor of the church, he talks about it in violent terms. And Paul doesn't seem to have a motive to exaggerate how bad he was in his past life. So yeah, I think I would say that there is still something there in the thought of there being a context of persecution, but I'd want to nuance that quite carefully, and I don't think I would put nearly as much weight on the idea that all of the apostles ended up being martyred.
So we've got the three facts on the table, and
yeah,
I think the sense that I get is you're confident in those facts. Maybe not for all the same reasons as Dr. Craig, but
I think that's right, for slightly different reasons. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and move to the next video. This is part 2. This is part 2, the explanation.
It's a matter of historical record that Jesus of Nazareth died and his body was placed in a tomb. It's also been firmly established that after his death and burial, his tomb was found empty. Various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive, and his disciples somehow became absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. These are the historical facts. How do you explain them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. Let's examine the 4 most popular ones. First, the conspiracy theory.
Well, I don't have much to to quibble with about the conspiracy theory. I mean, I think it's fair to say that no one is seriously defending it today for good reasons. And yes, I think so. Yeah, we probably could move on to talk about the general methodology. So yeah, I do have a worry about this idea that we can kind of, lay out a list of rival hypotheses, that's to say, sort of naturalistic explanations of the data that don't involve a resurrection. And the idea that we can kind of work through them and cross them off, and then with the idea being that we're just left with the resurrection hypothesis as the only one that can explain the data. So I think that the worry is that so if you approach this whole thing in terms of probabilities, you can see what the problem with this sort of process of elimination approach is. Because suppose that you have, let's say, 10 rival theories, 10 naturalistic theories on the table, and you think that each of them is improbable. But suppose that the disjunction of them, that's to say the probability of, one of them or another of them, say you've got 10, the probability of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, etc., being true is going to be obviously a lot higher than the individual probability of any one of them. And that's the thing you've got to pay attention to, I would say, is the disjunction, the probability of the disjunction of all of the naturalistic hypotheses. And that's what needs to be compared with the probability of the resurrection hypothesis. And so it's not really a case of just kind of going through this list and striking them off and never having to think about them again. Because, as I said, even if they have like a non-zero probability, even if it's a low probability, when you start adding up those different naturalistic hypotheses, that the disjunction could be significant. So yeah, I think.
Let me chime in there really quick with an analogy, just in case the viewers may not immediately get that point. I think that's a really good point. So a lot of people have rolled a die before. So a die has 6 sides, right? So if you ask, what's the probability of a 6 coming up?
Right.
It would be 1 out of 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what's the probability of one of the other sides, 1 through 5, coming up? 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. Well, then it's 5/6. Now, each one of those other sides is improbable too. It's only got a 1 out of 6 chance. But the disjunction of them, when you say 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, then it becomes, well, it looks like there's a 5/6. So it looks like, I guess in this case, the analogy would be, say everything in this list is improbable. Like, give it, if there's 10 things in the list, give each one, say, a 10% chance of being true, 0.1, you know what I mean? So when you cross off each one, you're like, oh, this one has lots of problems. It makes it very improbable. Like, let's give it a 0.1. This one's got lots of problems. Very improbable. Give it a 0.1. Well, the disjunction, when you add the other 9, you got 10 options. The other 9, it's going to be 0.9. It looks like there's a 90% chance that there was no resurrection. And there's only a 10% chance that there was a resurrection in that kind of toy. I know I'm giving toy numbers, but I hope that helps the viewer.
Yeah,
if they
that's very helpful. Yes, thank you, Jordan. That's a helpful way of explaining it. So yeah, I think, and I would imagine that Craig would acknowledge that point. And I think it may be that for the sake of a kind of accessible popular level presentation, they've gone for this sort of eliminating hypotheses, working down a list and then claiming, a little bit like that Sherlock Holmes quote that often gets mentioned in these contexts. Once you've eliminated that which is impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I mean, yeah, depending on how you interpret some of those terms, that quote might be true. But the problem is, impossible in the context of probability means probability 0. And I don't think anyone is going to seriously suggest that, a hallucination hypothesis has a probability of 0. And so you can't really use that sort of Sherlock Holmes type approach when it comes to this stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right, if it's okay, we'll continue with the video.
Finally, the hallucination theory. The disciples didn't really see Jesus, but just imagined that he appeared before them. They were all hallucinating. This theory also faces considerable problems. First, Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times. Not just in one place, but in different places. Not just to one person, but to different persons. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people. And not just to believers, but to unbelievers as well. There is nothing in the psychological casebooks on hallucinations comparable to these resurrection appearances. Second, hallucinations of Jesus would have led the disciples to believe at most that Jesus had been transported to heaven, not risen from the dead, in contradiction to their Jewish beliefs. Moreover, in the ancient world, visions of the deceased were not evidence that the person was alive, but evidence that he was dead and had moved on to the afterworld. Finally, this theory doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. Thus, the four most popular naturalistic theories fail to explain the historical facts.
I'll say this, and then I want you to comment. It's funny that the label, the four most popular naturalistic theories, that's the label they put on these.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, nobody defends the conspiracy or apparent death theory. No, maybe you'll find like one person. It's not popular at all.
But not people who have, professorships at universities.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right.
In fact, I'll say this. Maybe what seems like the most popular move to make, it would have been nice if the video addressed this, which this is kind of maybe a different methodology in general, is for somebody to say, we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
What we do know is, so maybe I'm spoiling
the
surprise.
No, I agree. And I think that, if I think about, I've tried my best to read around the scholarship on this topic. And if I think about some of the most kind of careful books by scholars who are non-Christians on the topic. So if I think about Geza Vermesh, so he would agree, he would grant all of the facts that were considered in the video in part one. But he just thinks that we can't know what happened. And it's not obvious that that's like an irrational position to end up at. I agree. I would say actually that perhaps is the most common position that you'll find defended amongst kind of responsible sort of non-Christian New Testament scholars today. I think that was a significant omission. So in terms of the hallucination hypothesis, I think there's a few things to say there. I mean, I'm going to go back to things I was saying earlier about the methodology, the sort of minimal facts methodology, and the approach which kind of puts all its eggs in one basket, with 1 Corinthians 15 being, or not necessarily all eggs in that basket, but most of them, with that being the source that bears the most weight in this case. And the problem with that approach is that it doesn't really give you the resources to say some of the things that the narrator was saying about the hallucination hypothesis. So, he was saying, so not just individuals, but groups. So that is there in 1 Corinthians 15. But then he said, in multiple different locations, and it had a map showing, Jerusalem and Galilee. Now that's not in 1 Corinthians 15. It said that he appeared many times, which I take it implies more than just a small handful. Well, that's not in 1 Corinthians 15 either. And so I think what's implicitly going on there is that, you're now sneaking in the back door a more kind of maximal data set, which is drawing on the gospel narratives of the resurrection appearances to try to counter the hallucination hypothesis. And I think what I would just say about that is that I think this shows that one to make a kind of a stronger case for a stronger historical case for the resurrection, you can't avoid having to get into the nitty-gritty with the question of the reliability of those gospel texts. Because 1 Corinthians 15 is too thin a data set to let you make some of these counterclaims that the narrator was making against the hallucination hypothesis. Now, in terms of, so then the claim was made that they, at most, if they'd had hallucinations or grief visions, that sort of thing, at most they would have claimed that he was transported to heaven, translated to heaven, that kind of thing. I mean, I think that there is something interesting there in terms of why this very unusual move of, well, not just unusual, but completely unprecedented move of saying that he had been that he had undergone resurrection, seemingly sort of ahead of the general resurrection of everyone at the end of time. And I mean, I don't think one could sort of put too much weight on this, but I think it is suggestive that the types of experiences that they must have had to lead them to say this were ones that were more robust than just some kind of very fleeting grief hallucination or something like that. In terms of the claim that the hallucination hypothesis can't explain the empty tomb, yes, that is true, that it can't explain the empty tomb on its own. But at the end of the day, I mean, the person who's the skeptic who's trying to explain the resurrection data, or sorry, the historical data without appealing to a resurrection, is at liberty to come up with some independent hypothesis for how the tomb came to be empty. And I suppose the best one would probably be some grave robbery by persons unknown, not grave robbery by the disciples, but just grave robbery of the sort that did happen from time to time in the ancient world. And of course, I think Craig would want to say, well, combining, an auxiliary hypothesis like that with the hallucination hypothesis is going to lower the prior probability, which is true. But at the end of the day, historical events can sometimes have very complex causes. And so I don't think that's kind of, I don't think that's the most devastating objection to the hallucination hypothesis.
So it seems to me that the most common objection is to say, we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
And then if somebody says, but let me try to offer, I take this to be basically what Dale Allison does in his new book on the resurrection. He says, let me offer what I think's the best scenario to explain these facts. And he says there's 3 ingredients in this scenario. One, there's the body was stolen by grave robbers. Now, there's standard kind of stock replies like, well, why would somebody steal the... Well, necromancy happened in the ancient world. And in that particular type of robbery, it's the corpse that you're interested in.
Right.
So he says grave robbers. 2, second ingredient is visions. He doesn't rule out that the visions could be veridical.
Yeah, that's right.
He doesn't rule that out, right? But he says they have these visions. And then he gives lots of cases where it's like people have visions where they actually touch and handle and hear and so on. Like there's multiple sensory experiences here. And then the third ingredient, he says, is the expectation that God's kingdom was coming when Jesus went into Jerusalem.
Right.
So he said, because then you have this category of resurrection. Resurrection is closely linked with the coming of the kingdom of God. And so he says, once you have those 3 things floating around together, it suddenly doesn't seem so strange that you would get resurrection, the disciples claiming resurrection about Jesus. Now, he says, look, I'm not saying that that's what actually even happened. He said he's not even saying that's what he believes. He's just saying that's a better scenario than the others that have been offered. And I think he's wanting to say, look, the data, the facts, they just don't force you to go one way or the other between, like, say, Jesus was raised from the dead and that scenario. A person, he said, it seems like he's saying a person can be completely rational and say, like, look, the data just doesn't force me either way. Okay, so I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks.
You can comment on that.
Yeah, very helpful unpacking of Alison's book. So I think that scenario you sketched, which Alison puts for, I take him to be saying there that this is like if he were a naturalist trying to explain away the historical data without appealing to anything supernatural, let's say, that this would be his best kind of, this sort of scenario would be his best bet. And I think that's broadly right. I think those ingredients would be the ones I would have in there if I was putting forward, the kind of best shot that if I were a skeptic and was trying to explain this data away, it would be something like Alison's scenario. Now, I do want to say this though. What's interesting to me is that, so Alison, you're right. He talks about the way that there are these cases in the parapsychology literature of, let's call them apparitions, which do sometimes have these multiple sensory modalities. They can seem extremely concrete and tangible and so on. So now I think though what the thing that means that he can't quite say that the skeptic can have that hypothesis is that he is open to those being veridical encounters with the dead, which is incompatible with naturalism, right? And I think, if he's right that these accounts that people have given are trustworthy, they're not embellished and so on, that the accounts in the parapsychology literature, and he's also interested in the near-death experiences literature, which I'm also very interested in. He takes all of that to be pretty strong evidence against naturalism, and he's talked about this in other books. He's got a recent book on religious experience where that's a big kind of theme. So I guess what I want to say there is, like, so bringing in these other parapsychology cases as parallels is interesting and is a worthwhile discussion to have. But I don't see it really helps a strict naturalist to put forward, because though if one takes seriously those cases in the parapsychology literature, I don't see how one could. I guess, like, if Alison's right that these people are kind of being sincere and are not embellishing these cases, then it doesn't look like these are just kind of the types of hallucinations that one would expect, that one could accommodate within a naturalistic picture. And Alison doesn't think they are. And so I would take Alison to be saying that these the historical data pertaining to Jesus it doesn't force one to he talks about the way that you could quite happily think that death isn't the end and that naturalism is false, but you wouldn't be forced by just reckoning with this historical data to think that specifically Christian theism is true. And I think on that point he may well be right, or at least let's put it like this: I don't think just a discussion of the empty tomb, the appearances, and so on is going to be enough. There's going to have to be a bigger discussion around the type of person Jesus was, and whether God would have reasons to raise this person in particular from the dead, which all of that would play into kind of increasing the prior probability of the resurrection. And I suppose I would want to say that when all of that stuff is factored in, then it becomes kind of probable that Jesus was raised from the dead. And that's kind of the approach that Richard Swinburne takes. So in his book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate, I think that's the title. So yeah, Swinburne thinks that the prior probability and the question of whether Jesus is the kind of person that God would want to raise from the dead, he thinks that question is at least as important as sort of the empty tomb, the appearances, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll add one thing to that, and then we can wrap up. Thank you for. I know we're a little over time, so I'll be quick. Yeah, so I've noticed there tends to right now in like the YouTube sphere be kind of like two camps almost. There's like the minimal facts camp, and then this maximal data approach.
Yeah.
And the thing that it seems like both are missing that I think is crucially important is what you just said, the prior probability.
Right.
I know in Lydia McGrew and Tim McGrew's Blackwell Companion article, they basically like, yeah, let the prior probability be really, really low.
Yeah.
Because the evidence is going to be so strong, it's going to make up for it.
Yeah.
And then there's basically hardly any discussion of a prior probability in Craig. I think there's maybe no discussion of it in well, I don't want to say that. I know that Mike Licona, he critiques, he's like, we shouldn't use this type of Bayesian analysis.
Right.
So we should just get rid of this stuff when we're doing historical in our historical methodology. But so I guess in that sense, he's like, yeah, we don't need that. So we're just, but I don't know. It just is like, man, this is so crucially important to the question of what's the probability that Jesus rose from the dead. And yeah, if you have independent reasons for thinking that not only God exists, but also that God would become incarnate, and that God would like how God incarnate would act, and how he might like put his signature on a certain person, all that stuff. If you think, yeah, there's good reasons to think that, then the prior probability starts going up, and then your evidence for the probability of the resurrection to be, say like more probable than not, your evidence doesn't have to make up much of the difference now, because your prior probability has gotten you a lot closer.
I would agree with that. And I would just add, one way to think about this is to do the following thought experiment. So imagine that you have basically the same sorts of textual evidence as we have for Jesus, pertaining to some figure in ancient history about whom we know nothing else other than that they were crucified, that they were buried in a tomb, and that a few days later their followers started claiming that they saw this person alive again, and that they thought they'd been resurrected. So yeah, suppose you just know nothing else at all about this person. What would you do with that? Would you end up believing that they'd been resurrected? And I suspect, well, I don't think I would. I think at best I would just be agnostic. I don't know what the explanation is. Yeah, I don't think we would take it nearly as seriously as we do in the case of Jesus, because we do know lots else about Jesus. We know lots about the kind of person he was, the kinds of things he taught, the sorts of very kind of polarizing reactions that he generated in his audiences, the sorts of things he kind of seems to be implying about his own authority, all of that kind of thing. The way he situates his own teaching and ministry in relation to the Old Testament, all of that, I think, is hugely important. And so, yeah, I think when you run a thought experiment like that, I think it can be helpful to get at the importance of the prior probability. Just to wrap up, then, I think we're on the same page in terms of like the lack of attention in general in the discussion around this topic to the prior probability. So yeah, I'm with you. I do think that is very important. And that's not to say that I don't think that the direct historical evidence is significant. I mean, and actually Dale Allison himself in his latest book does say at one point that he's never come across a case with all of these elements together. He obviously does spend a lot of time in some ways kind of trying to downplay how unprecedented these data points are. But yeah, he does admit that he's not come across something that has all of these different elements put together. So yeah, but I think and as well, I would add that I do think where I have sympathy with the McGrews is that one can't make this kind of historical case just on the basis of 1 Corinthians 15. I think it does need to. I think it ultimately the question of what kind of appearances are we talking about is crucial, and the only way to get at that is to get into the nitty gritty and engaging with the questions about how reliable are the reports, or the detailed reports in the Gospels about the appearances.
Well, I really appreciate you making this video with me, and I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jordan.